a live exclusive debate for you here on WURD with the candidates. Incumbent District Attorney Larry Krasner joining us here today, this afternoon for this debate, and his challenger, former Assistant District Attorney Carlos Vega. Everyone joining us in the virtual environment, of course, because we are still in the middle of the pandemic. I'm Charles Ellison, and I'm your co-moderator for this live debate, this live exclusive debate here on WURD. We are the home of Black Talk Media, 96.1 FM, 900 AM, WURDradio.com, many of you listening through there as well, and WURD TV. You can watch us on WURD TV, by the way. You can watch this debate as it unfolds for the next 90 minutes at facebook.com/4word and youtube.com/onword as well. Welcome to the program. I know many folks are listening in, and I also want to give a thanks, just a gesture of gratitude to the candidates and also their campaigns for making time this afternoon to talk with us and to talk with the audience here at WURD to talk about this very important race and the issues that are in it. Also joining me are my colleagues and co-moderators. We have Joann Bell, who is typically host of The Source, she's the founder of the Black Women's Leadership Council, the Black Women's Leadership Council segment on The Source, and that typically takes place today. So she, of course, naturally is joining us as a co-moderator. And also my good friend, colleague, Solomon Jones, who is host of Wake Up With WURD, our flagship morning show. He's also joining us. You can watch us all on Zoom. You see two screens of Solomon because in a moment, we're going to do a coin toss to see who gets the first questions, who goes first in this candidates debate. So now more on the candidates. You can find out more about incumbent Larry Krasner by simply going to krasner4da.com and then learn more about his challenger, Carlos Vega. He is at vega4da.com. So you have the two websites for both candidates so you can learn more about them during the course of this debate and as we are asking questions. Now, the moderators here will have no more than 60 seconds each to ask a question. So there's actually going to be a buzzer. So behind the scenes, you will hear a buzzer to keep us on point and to make sure we don't go over time. So we have no more than 60 seconds to ask a question, and each candidate will have 2 minutes to answer the same question. And that buzzer it's loud. You will hear it if you go over that 2-minute mark. There you go. Thank you. And that's Troy Wilmore, our intrepid, brilliant producer. He's a producer for Reality Check as well. So you hear him, he's behind the scenes, he has that buzzer there. We're gonna rotate around the moderators, around the round table of moderators for the question, for asking questions. So we'll go from host to host. And there is a stopwatch, once again, along with that buzzer to keep track of the time. So before we start the debate, we have to determine who will answer the first question. And so we're going to do a live coin toss. Solomon Jones will do the coin toss. We're going to do that on air, and you will be able to see that right now. The candidates have to see that coin toss to see who will go first, who will answer the first question. Solomon, have at it.
All right, so you see me on two different screens. So I have my phone so that you can see the coin. This is the back of the coin. This is the front of the coin. All right. And we're going to do a coin flip, and hopefully it won't go under my couch. So here we go. It's tails.
Yep. We can see that. Candidates, you see that it is tails, correct?
Yes.
All right.
I really didn't see it, but I trust you, so why not?
Okay. All right, it's tails.
Anything.
Thank you.
And so who goes, and that means that who goes first, Solomon?
Who called tails?
Who called tails?
Nobody called anything. You forgot.
Okay, let's do it again.
Let's do it one more time.
You guys haven't done this before, okay?
No, never did a coin flip at a debate. Okay, let's do it one more time.
One more time.
Don't throw it yet. We got to call it.
All right, we're going to let you guys call it. Who wants to call?
Let Larry call it first. He's the incumbent. Go ahead, Larry. Go.
I'm happy to let you do it, Mr. Vega, but I'll just call heads.
Okay, he's calling heads again. This is heads. This is tails. We're going to flip the coin. But it went on the floor. Okay.
There you go.
It's heads.
All right. What was that again? Who called? And D.A. Krasner called. You called heads. All right. So District Attorney, Incumbent District Attorney Larry Krasner will go first after the live coin toss. Thanks so much, Solomon.
You're welcome.
The very first, it's very interesting how we do things down in this virtual environment, but definitely appreciate it.
Good job, Solomon. I'm really impressed. Good job.
Thank you.
Don't leave your day job.
No, I won't. I'm a good talk show host, bad coin flipper.
No, that was great. Just breaking the ice somewhat here anyway. So let's go ahead with the first question. District Attorney Larry Krasner. So the full burden of crime fighting doesn't fall on your office alone. You don't stop or solve murders, but you prosecute and hold those accountable who have committed the murders. Still, you are a key partner and component of the city's crime fighting and anti-violence efforts. The impression is you don't have a good relationship with the police and due to ongoing and very personal tensions with the police union. Do you feel you need to fix that relationship or have one at all? And can you divorce your struggles with the police union from your essential relationship with the police department and commissioner?
So thank you for the question. I appreciate it. It is very important we distinguish between the police department, which is led by our commissioner, Daniel Outlaw, and the leadership of the FOP, which is the police union. The fact is that I communicate with Commissioner Outlaw on a very regular basis. We have achieved significant collaborative reforms that I think are very important. I consider that relationship just like I considered my relationship with Richard Ross before her to be excellent. I also feel like the relationship with a lot of the upper echelon, the higher level brass within the police department is quite good. A lot of good innovations going on, and I'm happy to talk about them. That is entirely different than a relationship with the leader of the Fraternal Order of Police, a man named John McNesby, who took no vote from his members when he endorsed Donald Trump twice, and took no vote from his members when they chose to endorse my opponent and give him $120,000 directly and indirectly so far. John McNesby has stood for the following. He has defended the wearing of Nazi tattoos in uniform by a Philadelphia police officer while on duty. He has permitted members of the Proud Boys into the officers only area of FOP Hall to drink beer with police officers a couple months before the insurrection. This is someone who has referred to Black Lives Matter as, quote, a pack of rabid animals, unquote. And this is a leadership that has always been male, it has always been white, and it has always been Republican. They have very, very little to do, in fact, with the current law enforcement officers in Philadelphia, many of whom are truly excellent. The reality is he plays to the retired membership because most of the members of the FOP are retired. And so he is not the voice of the present. He is not the voice of the police department. He is the voice of the past. My dad served in World War II. I got a problem with a guy who plays footsie with American Nazis. The issue here is dealing with the police department, not dealing with that Trumpian.
Mr. Vega, if you want to follow up on that, and you're getting quite a bit of support from the police unions, from the Fraternal Order of Police. So do you feel like you need to have a close relationship with them if you were to become DA?
No, not at all. Absolutely. I'm the only person here who's running, who's held the police accountable. I put police officers in jail. I have a prosecutor officer for killing 2 people. I prosecuted a homicide detective whose girlfriend committed a murder. I prosecuted her. She pled guilty, and I prosecuted him, and he pled guilty and went to prison. Unlike Mr. Krasner, who talks about the FOP, yet he has investigated 51 cases, arrested 51 officers, and he has yet in his tenure to put a single police officer in prison. He's gotten not guilties. His cases have been discharged. He's reduced 3 of those cases to misdemeanors where they got probation. 1 case got ARD where they sealed his record. And what is striking is 1 case where a police officer tried to kill his son, shot him in the back. The negotiation between Mr. Krasner and that officer was 11.5 to 23 months house arrest. Now think of that. You try and kill your son, shoot him in the back, and you get house arrest. So no, I have to work with the police. and I'm going to be at odds with the FOP many times because I have a vision, and in my platform is to address issue and bringing in a police reform. So no, and I'll use the issue or the question of working with Outlaw. Outlaw and before her, Commissioner Ross, in dealing with the gun violence, have been on odds with Larry. In terms, you've heard Ms. Outlaw say, Commissioner Outlaw say, there are no consequences. We are getting rid of guns in record numbers, yet there are no consequences. It's a revolving door. Commissioner Ross, once again, he was doing the job. His officers taking guns off the street at record numbers, yet it was a revolving door. I'll use just one statistic. This year, from this January to April 30th, the police have arrested and taken 348 guns off the street. Of those cases, 233 of those cases were withdrawn, dismissed, not guilty. They've only secured 6 convictions at trial for gun cases. Now, let's talk about it. We have the same judges, we have the same police department. The only thing that changed was Mr. Krasner coming in office in 2018. So yes, I will work with the police. I'm not owned by the FOP because think of it this way. I will not have my history or my story rewritten by a white, rich, out-of-touch elitist who's telling me I'm Puerto Rican. I grew up poor. I've had to battle barriers, discrimination, both in school as a young man and also in the district attorney's office in the court system. So yes, I've done the first in many things, and no, I will not be defined that the FOP endorsed me, because you know what we're forgetting in this whole conversation? In 2017, when Larry ran for office.
All right, I'm sorry. For some reason, I didn't hear the buzzer for some reason, and so just to give folks.
I didn't hear the buzzer.
But you got over your 2-minute limit, so we got to go on to Joann Bell to ask the next round of questions. For some reason, I didn't hear the buzzer. Go ahead, Joann.
Mr. Vega, this question is for you. You served as an assistant DA for over 30 years. During this period, unconstitutional stops and frisks occurred, mass incarceration of members of the Philadelphia's minority community flourished, cash bail deprived low-income people of the right of their freedom, and police misconduct framed innocent people. This was tolerated and supported by former DAs Lynn Abraham and Seth Williams. Considering their dismal records, why didn't you run against them?
Well, I never thought I'd be running for district attorney. From my background, my mother came to this country from Puerto Rico. She raised a family. We owned a bodega. She was a victim of crime. We were robbed at gunpoint. My grandmother and sister robbed at knife point. Also, my friends during the heroin epidemic in the 70s were swallowed up by the street. Drug overdoses, ending up in Rikers Island, committing crimes, selling drugs. So I decided I wanted to be a prosecutor, to be that voice for people like my mother, but also bring a level of compassion and knowledge of people that are committing crime, that they're not bad people. It's their circumstances that have caused them to make some bad decisions. So I never ran for office because I never wanted to be a politician. The reason I'm running for office now is I'm a Philadelphian. I'm a single father. I raised 2 children. My youngest is 17, my daughter's 24, and I see the numbers of murders that have been happening since he's taken office. Every year has escalated. Think of this past year, 499 murders, and now we may have 600 murders. Let's talk about this Mother's Day weekend. We had 25 shootings, 7 murdered. 3 of those victims were women. So I decided to run for office because as a father, as a single dad, as a person of color that we suffer the most, I decided to run for office. But I also worked for Rendell, Castillo, Lynn Abraham, Seth Williams, and let's not forget Kelly Hodge. I was never put in a position of power or a position of making policy. I was a line DA addressing the violence committed against Black mothers and fathers where their children were lost. So why am I running? Because I care about this city and we need to bring in reform, but also we need to make our citizens safe. As I've taken this journey running for office, all the people are telling me, we want to be safe. I spoke to a couple who were raising their grandchild. Their son was killed. Look at what happened this past Mother's Day. The levels of violence are out of control. We need someone who will work well with the community, with the police department, with other city leaders to bring in the change, the reform we need, but I need to put it this way. We talk about mass incarceration, but we don't talk about.
All right. The next question, Joann, I think we'll go to
I will follow
Mr.
up
Krasner.
with Krasner on the same question, but I want to tweak it just a little bit. What did you think of the records of DA Lynn Abraham and Seth Williams on the issues that I raised about mass incarceration, but more particularly the police misconduct in framing innocent people? We have lots of stories that are hitting the news now of people being released because of police misconduct.
So, you know, one of the things I think is that the Philadelphians deserve to know that not only was my opponent a part of that, there's not a single white paper, not a single memo, not a single initiative during his 35 years that suggested he was in any way opposed to that kind of terrible conduct that was going on. But he has actually sat and said under oath in the last couple of years that in 35 years, he never saw a coerced confession. He never saw police officers planting any kind of evidence. You really got to have your head in the sand to actually see the world that way. That is certainly not how Philadelphia sees it. What do I think? I think it is terrible. You know, there is an oath a prosecutor takes. I took it, and that is an oath to seek justice all the time, to uphold the Constitution all the time. The reason we have 20 exonerations during just a little bit over 3 years, about 3.5 years, in a city that never had any kind of meaningful exonerations before, is that there was so much cheating. There was so much lying. There was so much inaccuracy that went on. In nearly all of these exonerations, we see truly innocent people who lost decades of their lives while guilty people went free. Why? Because it was all about winning. It wasn't about justice. It wasn't about accuracy. And it will come as no surprise to anyone on this call that with only one exception, every single one of those exonerees was black. That's just black or brown, excuse me. That's just the reality of what we're talking about here. It's not enough. It is not enough for my opponent to say, I wasn't in charge. You know what that is? I'll do whatever you tell me. When Mr. Vega tells you he has a platform, let me explain to you what that platform actually is. He told the Philadelphia Inquirer he would not change any of our policies. That's what he said. His platform is basically two things: fear and deception. There is no plan. There are no ideas any different than what we have had, and Philadelphia knows better than that.
All right, Solomon Jones has the next round of questions.
All right.
Go ahead, Solomon.
So I'll start with this one. The police union here, the FOP, Lodge Number 5, blames the DA for the increase in shootings and homicides. But the DA can't try cases unless there are arrests. The record here, quite frankly, is dismal. In 2020, just 1 in 6 shootings resulted in a suspect in custody. How does a DA prosecute cases when no one is being arrested for the shootings? And at what point do the police have to shoulder the blame? Mr. Krasner, that question goes first to you.
Well, let me say this. I'm not actually interested in blaming. I don't think that's constructive. I am definitely interested in collaborating with law enforcement partners and especially with our police commissioner. I can tell you that this is a major struggle that we have in Philadelphia. The Inquirer recently reported that solve rates for homicides are something like 20% below the national average, and that in good times, the average for solving non-fatal shootings was about 2 in 10. You have correctly noted that during this pandemic, it was down to about 0.16 out of 10. Let me try that again, 1.6 out of 10. So the vast number of shootings are not going solved. What do we have to do about that? Well, there's some collaborative things happening already. The police commissioner asked my office for the first time in the history of the DA's office to collaborate with them in trying to investigate shootings. We were very happy to accept that invitation. We placed 12 of our prosecutors in the detective divisions around the city for the first time in the history of the city. I have been trumpeting for a very long time that we need to have top flight forensics in Philly. And in some ways we do. We have an excellent police head of forensics, but there are a couple types of forensics available now that could go a long way towards solving these shootings. That's a good part of it. Another good part of it, though, frankly, is we got to restore trust between prosecutors who cheated and lied and convicted innocent people and communities. We have to restore trust between police who have done illegal stop and frisk and driving while black, who have been willing to test a lie, We have to restore trust between the good police in this department who are tainted by the actions of someone like John McNesby and some of their colleagues who are not doing the right thing. And once we can restore that trust, we can get witnesses and we can get them out. So you can't do this overnight, but we have worked very steadily. And I think Philadelphians understand quite clearly what this administration is about, that we want integrity, we want a modern police department, and we want, in a collaborative way, to be able to improve the solve rate. Our conviction rate is nearly 85%, nearly 85% for all shootings, fatal and non-fatal, which is incredibly high and is done without cheating. And we're very...
All right, Mr. Krasner ran out of time. Go ahead, Solomon.
All right, same question, Mr. Vega, to you. The police union, and I'll repeat it, blames the DA for the increase in shootings and homicides, but the DA can't try cases unless there are arrests. The record here is dismal. In 2020, just 1 in 6 shootings resulted in a suspect in custody. How does the DA prosecute cases when no one is being arrested for the shootings? And at what point do the police have to shoulder some blame?
Well, the thing is that the police and the judges have been the same in 2017 as they are in 2018. The only thing that is different is Mr. Krasner. When we're talking about the arrests they're not making, let's talk about the arrests they are making from the DA's own data board.
I'm sorry, sir. I just need you to answer that question, though, about the arrests that they are making and whether or not a DA can try cases if there are no arrests.
Okay, a DA cannot try a case if there's no arrest. It doesn't exist. What I'm saying is, and I'll take a gunpoint robberies. There were 136 arrests, which the DA approved the charges. There was sufficient evidence. Of those 136, 93 of those cases were withdrawn, dismissed, or verdict not guilty. They only got at trial only 3 convictions. So think of it. Those are charges that they brought that the DA's office approved. Of aggravated assault with a gun, there were 186 arrests that the DA's office approved, saying there's sufficient evidence. Of those cases, 157 were withdrawn, dismissed, or not guilty. They only at trial got 2 convictions. So the police, so let's talk about if they don't make arrests, it doesn't exist. But what they did make an arrest for, that they approved the charges, that the DA's office, there was sufficient evidence, they got 2 convictions. And that sends a message to witnesses who are afraid to testify, saying there are going to be no consequences. I'm going to testify and I'm in danger. And when you talk about the FOP, that you have to hold them accountable and everything, let's talk about holding the DA's office accountable. Let's talk about his chief of homicide, Anthony Voci, who had a case where he is white, making $160,000, who is Miss Larry's friend, who abused his power, arrested a young black female, had her arrested, her car confiscated. She lost her job, at which point those charges were not viable, were not brought. She is suing the city for millions, at which point, where's the accountability in that office? He is still there making the same salary. And I'd ask to have Larry answer that question. Where is he? What is doing and what working in terms of somebody?
All right, you ran out of time, Mr. Vega. Mr. Krasner, this question goes to you, and thanks so much, Solomon, too. I appreciate that round of questions. Throughout your tenure as district attorney, your first term as DA, Mr. Krasner, you focused on reforming the so-called criminal justice system. You were elected on that platform, but Philadelphia is now gripped in a raging gun violence crisis, and it's tearing away at the fabric of the city amid all the other problems we're going through. So how do you, in a very clear way, convince people that criminal justice and mass incarceration reform leads to more safety? Let's take them off mute. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Not sure how that happened. So you tell them the truth, which is not what my opponent is doing at all. He keeps rattling off these statistics. What he's actually telling you about is a number of new arrests that happened this year. None of those arrests have concluded. And he's taking cases that resolved from prior periods and coming up with magic math about how somehow we lost all these cases. None of that is true. Our conviction rate for gun violence in general is actually quite high. And our conviction rate for shootings is better than it was when he was in that office, nearly all time periods. That's the truth. We need to stick with the truth if we're going to talk about this. So what is the truth? The truth is that we have an 85% conviction rate for shootings, fatal and non-fatal. We have 5 or 6 new collaborations in the last 2 years with the PPD that I think have been very successful. And we said from the very beginning that criminal justice reform goes hand in hand with focusing on the most serious crimes. There are no more serious crimes than shootings and gun homicides. There are other ones that are quite serious, but none more serious. So we focus on them intensely. We have a very talented staff, and we do a very good job with them. You know, that is crucial. Now, outside of the office itself, we have to be honest about this, though. The reality is that in 50 major U.S. cities last year, the increase in gun violence was 42%. The increase in Philly was 40%, which is terrible. But what is happening is not unique to Philadelphia in any way. Studies that look specifically at all these cities show that some that have it worse than us are Republican, some are Democratic, some have traditional prosecutors, some have progressive prosecutors. What's happening here is that the FOP and their candidate, my opponent, are weaponizing a national tragedy. And they're weaponizing it because they're not concerned primarily about public safety. They're concerned about politics. They do not want to be accountable, and that they know that with Mr. Vega, who will serve them, they will not be accountable.
Mr. Vega, a follow-up question. So according to campaign finance reports, your campaigns received over $25,000 from the Fraternal Order of Police Lodge 5, $80,000 from Protect Our Police PAC. We know of $50,000 from Protect Our Police PAC spending money on TV ads. And that PAC has failed to file a campaign finance report last month, so we don't know the full extent of that support. Why does the FOP, why does the police union support you so strongly? You're not bothered by that, particularly at a moment like this in this nation's history, and now you're stressing yourself as a reform and safety candidate. But I don't understand. You have to enlighten me. How are you going to achieve reform if you're getting so much support from an organization that's not supporting police reform? Oh, let's bring him off mute, everyone.
You guys keep putting me on mute. In talking about the $25,000 that they gave to me, you have to realize this. When I announced my candidacy, I thought other people were going to run for office. They did not. I became the only person. And by a process of elimination, you see the relationship that Mr. Krasner has, that in 2017, he asked for their support, did not get it, even though they had endorsed Trump. And I got it because I'm the only person running for office. In terms of Back the Police PAC, I did not know they gave me any money. I don't think they're allowed to. And I've also renounced their support in terms of the statement they made about George Floyd, that he caused his own death, his own murder.
But sir, why are they so enthusiastic about you?
I can't speak for that, why they're enthusiastic. What I want to know is why are people out of state, California billionaires, New York billionaires are being funding his campaign? Why Real Justice and Sean King have attacked me and my family and my followers, my supporters, and raising money for him also. We have to ask that question. Why do they like Larry so much that I'm being attacked, that I'm being vilified? Why is it that all my donors are from Philadelphia? Let's exclude the FOP. Let's talk about the Philadelphians that are backing me. And he started talking about accountability, and I'll talk about accountability to one of his special advisors who left her child in a car for 2 hours where she was arrested. Where is the accountability on that when this person is making decisions of someone's freedom or not and doesn't know enough to take their child out of the car in the summer? Let's talk about a person in their CARES program, while on duty, solicits of prostitutes, has sex, and then kills that person. Where's the accountability there? So when you talk about the FOP, I've held them accountable. I've put police officers in jail. I have to work with the police. That's Commissioner Outlaw. So I don't know what he's talking about. And in terms of this, I was a line DA. I didn't set policy. But if you look at my record of over 450 murders, not once have I been brought before the disciplinary board. That speaks volumes of my character and why I'm running.
Go ahead, Joann. And also, just for clarification too, Mr. Vega, we're not just muting you, we muted Larry Krasner. So once it reaches that 2-minute mark, and I do apologize if I didn't clarify before, we are going to mute you if we can't hear the buzzer. For some reason, we weren't hearing the buzzer, or at least I wasn't hearing the buzzer. So that's okay. We'll just mute you when you reach that 2-minute mark. So I just want to clarify. Just want to clarify, everyone, we're sticking with it. We're making sure everyone gets equal time. Joann, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to revisit the last question because I had a similar question, but framed a little differently. And this goes to Mr. Vega. Considering most of the recent nationwide murders and abuse of Black and brown men, women, and children by law enforcement, how can you, in good conscience, and just in good conscience, accept what we in the Black community call blood money from local and national police organizations and PACs. And particularly some of the more onerous PACs are funded by right-wingers who are also involved in trying to deny the vote to people of color. So my question is, how can you in good conscience take their money?
Well, you're having people who are donating money and rewriting the person I am. I'm a person of color. I'm a person who grew up poor, who knows what hunger is, knows what violence is. I'm running for office not because of some political thing to aggrandize myself. I'm doing it because I'm a father. I'm a person of color who's seen my friends die, who've worried about my mother. So when you say it's blood money, no, not at all. When I talk about, you talk about violence, let's talk about the reality. We suffer violence at record rates. And we had Mr. Krasner or Larry talk about addressing violence. Let's talk about Isis Nicole Williams, a 24-year-old Black mother with 3 daughters who was attacked. She was chased. She was beaten. She was punched. She was bitten by a boyfriend who said he had AIDS. And what did the DA's office do? At the first listing, saying prosecutor discretion, drop the charges. And what happened weeks later? What happened months later? When she was talking on the phone with her mother, he broke into the house and shot her in her head with her five-day-old baby in front of there. So that's why I'm doing this. So blood money is this. I'm trying to stop the blood that is happening in our community. When you talk about blood money, I refuse to have that thrown on me. I fought this, I faced discrimination, and even as a lawyer, after 35 years of service, I was fired by a white person, a white elitist, out of touch, saying a Latino is not good enough to serve in this office. A person was never given the chance to set policy in the office. So for 35 years, I tried to make a change, and in 35 years, all the administrations, they didn't think I was good enough to set policy. And what is shocking and an insult to me is that a white individual took office without so much as an interview, said, you are gone. So guess what? I take offense of the blood money because I'm trying to do my job. And once again, I put officers in jail. I will be battling the SOP in many.
Okay, go ahead, Joann. Next question to Mr.
So, Mr. Krasner, let me follow up on that question, because one of my questions to you is that when you took office in 2018, you fired 31 assistant DAs. Some have accused you of playing out a vendetta that you were harboring as a former defense attorney. Why were these people fired?
Thank you for that question. So you have just seen something that's very important to recognize about my opponent. He just suggested to you that I fired him because of race, as if I didn't know him well. Well, here's the truth. He sued me for firing him. And do you know what he said the reason was? Because he was discriminated against based upon age. Age. He never once said it was about race. But he wants to suggest to you something else because he thinks he can get away with it. This is a platform built on deceit. Why did I fire Carlos Vega? I got to know Carlos Vega very well over a 5-year period in litigating a case where I represented a schizophrenic man. I was hired by the court to do it, which means I was paid pennies for 5 years of work. And in watching Mr. Vega for 5 years, especially during that trial, I saw him time and time again lie to the court, lie to me, and engage in all kinds of conduct that did not meet a minimal ethical standard. I did not fire him because he was 4 or 5 years older than me. Right after that happened, I hired an 84-year-old woman to be my first assistant. And the average age of people I hired went up. But that didn't stop Mr. Vega from saying to you what he just said to try to deceive you on that basis. And it didn't stop him from filing what is, in fact, in my opinion, a bogus lawsuit, claiming that somehow the 60-year-old discriminates against people who are 65 or whatever ages we were back when that happened. You're going to see this over and over with Mr. Vega. You're going to see that this is based on fear and deceit, fear and deceit, fear and deceit. Even when he gives you specifics of cases, it is morphed, it is twisted. He is not giving you the specifics. This is his typical Trumpian tactic of laying down one untruth after another so quickly, I can barely respond.
Solomon Jones has the next round of questions. Go ahead, Solomon.
You know, I had one question, but I have to ask this question, and I'm supposed to start with Mr. Krasner, but Mr. Vega, I have to ask you this because when Joann asked you the last question, you talked about why you were running, And the last thing that you said was that you were fired by a white man who fired you because he felt like a Latino could not do the job. And I just have to ask this because I think a lot of people are wondering, are you running against Larry Krasner because he fired you?
Absolutely not. I'm running because I'm a father. I'm running because I'm a person of color. I'm running because my city is dying. Okay, we're going to have 600 murders this year. I'm running because before the pandemic, and he likes to blame the pandemic on everything, let's talk about Trevon Register, a 6-year-old boy who their charges were brought when a man chased him and his mother with a chain. They ran to the car and that man was arrested for endangering the welfare of a child. And what did the DA's office do? They dropped the charges. And what happened to that 6-year-old boy? Who was 3 foot 7 inches tall, only 40 pounds, he was beaten to death. And when you talk about beaten to death, let's talk about his injuries. The ME described those injuries that he never seen anything like that, only in a high-speed car crash. His lungs, his liver, his spleen were lacerated. His stomach was full of blood. He had 8 rib fractures. His kidney was nearly cut in half. So that's why I'm running. So that won't happen to another child. That's why I'm running. I'm running also because I want to have the office be representative of people of color. As we see, out of 320 DAs, only 45 are Black. That's 45. Of those making over $80,000, 114 make $80,000, only 12 are Black. I promise when I take office, I'm going to put in a woman of color. I've already vetted, and I want 3. I want 3 Black women, okay? I'm looking at them, who have prosecutorial experience, defense attorney experience, civil experience. Because I think we need now, as we have a woman of color who is vice president, I think we need a first assistant to be a woman of color in that office to bring about the change, to bring in district attorneys of color. Because you know what? Most victims are Black. Most victims are people of color, and we need lawyers who look like us, speak like us, who has lived our history to be making those decisions of whether to make our community safe, but also giving those people who need redemption, who can get it.
All right, Solomon, to Mr. Krasner.
Okay, so this is my original question. So we've learned that at least 20 people were wrongly convicted in Philadelphia, that some homicide detectives routinely coerced confessions in the cases they handled, and that it cost the city millions of dollars in settlement. We expect to see more people exonerated as the cases are looked at more closely. Here's my question. Should the detectives and/or prosecutors involved in these wrongful convictions face criminal charges? And will you charge them?
So let me say, some of them may face criminal charges. It is one thing to make a mistake. It is one thing to violate the law in a way that amounts to something worthy of civil liability. It is another thing to do a kidnapping on paper. And I will tell you, if the law permits within the statute of limitations, which could be an issue, and if we see conduct that is so blatant, it's clear, it rises to the level of criminal intent, I am interested in the possibility of doing that. I'm not going to comment on what might or might not be any open investigation. I think it is very important, though, for people to understand my opponent and what he is doing here. He just rattled off a bunch of nonsense about how we do not hire Black people in this office. I mean, that is shameful. It is shameful because time and time and time again, this has been debunked. The fact on this is that we have done better at increasing the talent and diversity of that office than any prior administration, than any time period during Mr. Vega's entire 35 years in the office, when he did nothing that he can point to improve this. When we came in that office, there were 72 Black employees out of about 600. There are now 170. When we came in the office, there were 35 Black attorneys. There are now 55, not the 45 he just told you untruthfully. There are now 55, and we have hired another group who will be in September. We will be at 70. That is a 100% increase. He would like you to think that we do not have African-American people in senior positions. Nonsense. My first assistant, one of them, is Robert Listenby. Mr. Listenby is Black. He also was Barack Obama's choice to run juvenile justice for the United States of America. The chief of our municipal court unit is Deb Watson Stokes. also Black, and a very experienced prosecutor in the office. That's a very important position because you train the young attorneys. I could go on, but there's not sufficient time. It is clear my opponent will say absolutely anything, and he will say absolutely anything when he knows better. Do you trust that person to be your chief prosecutor?
Thanks for those questions, Solomon. Mr. Vega, I have a question for you, just sort of a clarification here. So in the 1980s, right, the homicide clearance rates by the Philadelphia Police Department were nearly 80% of all murders. But the number declined, I think it was between 2010, 2015 to 65% clearance, and then below 50% since 2016, 2017, before Mr. Krasner became DA. You were assistant district attorney during the course of time where those homicide clearance rates fell precipitously. And I would assume that your office or you as ADA had a problem with that at that time, those low homicide clearance rates. What was going on then? Explain that to me. Why such a precipitous drop in homicide clearance rates, and why didn't you raise that, or what were you doing about it back then?
Okay. I think you and Larry keep forgetting the fact that I was a line DA. I wasn't the district attorney. I wasn't a unit chief. I wasn't a deputy to set policy, or else there would have been more people of color. Because think of it this way. In 35 years of service and 30 years in the homicide unit, I was the first and only Latino to try murder cases. Think of that. In 30 years, I was the only one.
So you tried murder cases, but did you have a problem with those low homicide clearance rates?
It's not a question of do I have a problem. That's the police department. I know when I first got into homicide, when a murder occurred, the policy was those detectives did not go home for 4 days to solve that murder. As you see this TV show, The First 48, you solve those murders by having the teams there addressing it. After that, there were issues of citywide. Talk to the mayor and the police commissioner. Overtime was cut. Officers were sent home. Detectives were sent home. So in that period of time that you need to address those issues, it was cut short. But in terms of that, you have to talk to the police commissioner, the mayors at those periods of time that they made certain decisions.
So you acknowledge now that the Philadelphia Police Department is responsible for homicide rates, for murders?
No. The person who's responsible is people doing the killing. The people responsible is the DA's office successfully prosecuting cases. People responsible is people from the community have to step forward. And I know they're afraid to give information of those murders. Remember how people talk about the don't snitch policy. Also cases that I've had where witnesses have been threatened and several of them killed. So that is an issue of why some of the clearance rates have occurred. Now, so those are issues. So you're asking me questions about what the police department has done. I can tell you what I have done.
Mr. Krasner, violent crime, as we all know, is rising very alarmingly in Philadelphia. Yet your office went from 32% of all criminal cases resulting in convictions in 2017, right before you came on board, 2018 started, but it's down to now 17%. For violent crimes, it went from 10% of all violent crime cases resulting in convictions down to now 3%. For firearms cases, it went from 8% in 2017 to now 2%. The way that looks is that you're prosecuting less. And what explains that? Do you mean to tell us that Philadelphia police evidence collecting methods are either that corrupt or incompetent that you were forced to drop so many cases? I'm sure you understand the way that looks, that you're not prosecuting violent crimes as much as you need to.
Mr. Ellison, let me say, I can't see what you're looking at. But we have had this.
That's from your own database. That's from your own Philadelphia District Attorney's dashboard.
Let me finish, if I may. I think you may be looking at the percent of cases that actually are resolved at trial. I mean, I can't see what you're looking at, but those numbers do not sound like they are correct to me, or that they're representative of what happened before the pandemic. I would, and I'm happy to look at it and see what you're talking about. But I would remind you that the courts have effectively been closed during this pandemic with tremendous problems. But let me say this. You want to talk about clearance rates? Let me talk to you about clearance rates. Tony Wright was falsely convicted 30 years ago, and he was counted in that clearance rate. What used to happen in Philadelphia, both with the DA's office and with the Philadelphia Police Department, is they considered a case cleared whether you did it or not. It was not an accurate clearance rate. And as we look at those statistics, they still have not been adjusted for so many innocent people who were convicted who should not have been convicted. This is fundamental to understanding the mentality of the FOP, the mentality of my opponent.
And I understand that about clearance rates in the FOP, Mr. Krasner, but going back to convictions, and also you make a very high usage of diversion programs for gun possession cases. The average rate for diversion for illegal firearms possession cases between 2018 and 2020 jumped about 87%. But do we have evidence that that works?
So when
in
you
a gun violence crisis like this?
Mr. Ellison, when you say 87%, let's talk about the real numbers here. What you're talking about is an increase from a tiny percent to another pretty tiny percent. My recollection, the last time I saw this number, was that the number of gun possession cases where we diverted was only 2.5%. It was up from prior administrations where they might have been at 1% or 1.5%. But yes, if you go from 1.5% to 2.5%, that is something like a 70%, 87% increase. It is by no means the case that this is common. And we do that in cases where you have someone, for example, like a college student who has been traumatized, beaten up, goes and buys a gun legally, has no indication of being involved in criminal activity, but doesn't get the permit to carry that is required.
All right, we had to mute you, Mr. Krasner. I'm going on to the next round of questions by Ms. Joann Bell. Go ahead, Joann.
I'm going to follow up on two things, and I want to go to DA Krasner for a moment and follow up. Some of the things that are being said about the violent crime, that you release people and then they come back and commit violent crime. And I think you were about to discuss the dismissal of gun charges. I want you to set the record straight. How many of these offenders that were released by you or caused to be released by you have later come back and committed a violent crime?
So thank you for asking me that question. I think a lot of people don't quite understand what our power is. We do not release people. We are not the ones who set bail. Bail is set by judges. We are not the ones who sentence. Sentencing is done by judges. We make our recommendations on bail, and then the defense makes their recommendations, and then a judge decides whether or not to impose bail. And that's become, in some ways, a more difficult decision during a pandemic, but because you don't want to have death caused by having an excessive number of people in custody. But obviously, we also don't want to have death on the street. So there are times when we have very strong disagreements with judges, and we want people held who are not held, especially when it comes to shooting cases. We've been very vigorous in seeking basically $1 million bail on every shooting case that is non-fatal, that people be held without bail on fatal cases. So, you know, I understand that it can be convenient for people to want to believe that somehow the DA controls who's in and out of custody. No, we don't. We also don't control when probation or parole puts down a detainer or not, and we also don't control the sentences that are given by a lot of judges. But we are more than willing to look at our record on any and every case to see whether we advocated for a position that turned out to be correct. In every administration, there has always been crime. In every administration, there have always been individuals who came out and on occasion they did things that are bad. And that is the reason that you're seeing my opponent not talk to you in terms of real statistics or patterns or anything else. He's talking to you with the fear narrative. I can point to a terrible case. Yes, you can. And I could point to many terrible cases that occurred on Mr. Vega's watch during 35 years. You know, this is what we do. We are dealing with a situation in which there are terrible things that happen, and we have to do our very best to prevent them. But the notion that any of us can completely eliminate the possibility of harm or victimization is just wrong. What we can do is work towards prevention, and then we will all be a lot safer.
All right, next question, Joann, for Mr. Vega.
Mr. Vega, I'm going to go back to something that Solomon asked you about running. And are you running because you were fired from the DA's office? And then I asked you a question regarding your over 30 years in the DA's office, in which you worked for several DAs whose records brought on mass incarceration. We have had, you know, innocent people framed and a number of things that have injured the Black and brown community. And you indicated that you yourself have had broad experience growing up in New York City, and that your dedication is to correct some of these things. So I still wonder, in those 30 years, why you didn't run then, because these atrocities took place over a period of 30 years. Why now instead of sometime within that 30-year span?
Okay. Briefly to address another point, when Mr. Krasner says or Larry said that he fired me because of a case we had against each other that we had for 5 years, he could have taken me to the disciplinary board. He did not. In fact, I'm going to look for an old text he sent me where he really credits me that I was so fair and honest. But with that said, why am I running, or why didn't I run? Number one, I was raising a family. I'm a single dad of 2 children. I reached a crossroads, whether to leave the office and go into private practice, or work at a big firm and make money, or turn my back on the mothers I represent who've lost their children. I decided to stay there because I believe we need a person that has that commitment. And I worked 15 years at night at UPS. Think of it. I was doing serious murder cases by day, and at night at Front in Oregon, I was working 15 years at night, loading and unloading trucks. As you see, a campaign is a rich man's game. I don't live in $1 million house like Mr. Krasner. I don't drive a Tesla like Mr. Krasner. My children didn't go to friends like Mr. Krasner's. I had to work, and I have suffered financial losses that I'm raising a family. Now, with that said, the donors he gets are from the rich elite. People don't live in Philadelphia. Billionaires, not millionaires, billionaires from California and other states. What am I getting? And look at my financials. Everybody talks about the FOP. Talk about the people who live in Philadelphia who are being ravaged by violence. And that's why I'm running, because I've committed for 35 years. I told the office when I retired I was going to do cases for free. And once again, I say this, I am running because I care about this city. Remember, my children, my boy, 17 years old, is the color, the age of the next victim. Not only to have violence, but maybe being abused by some police misconduct. So that's why I'm doing it. So people just wonder, why am I running? Because I care. Why am I running? I'm the underdog. Look at what I'm fighting, a giant with millions and millions of dollars behind me. And I'm doing it because I care about you.
We had to actually run out of time, Mr. Vega. Solomon Jones, you get the next round of questions.
Okay, so I will start with Mr. Vega since Mr. Krasner had the first question last time. The conditions in Kensington surrounding the opioid crisis have gained a lot of attention nationally in recent years. But as Kensington resident Bill McKinney wrote recently for WHYY, quote, the inability to address violence, addiction, and homelessness are symptoms of a larger disease. This disease includes repeating similar failed structural responses for the past 20 years. Mr. Vega, you've touted tough on crime tactics for almost everything, but this resident and many other residents I've talked to in Kensington during my many visits there have said none of that has worked. What would you do differently as DA to address these long-standing issues in one of our poorest communities?
Well, when I came to the DA's office in 1982, because of my being bilingual, I did all the cases in the Kensington area. And it was dangerous then, but not the level we see now. When I was there recently, in the morning, someone had an overdose, and they were using Narcan to save that person's life. Those stores on the avenue can't even function with the people getting high in front of them. What I would do in addressing this issue is this: being aware that these people addicted to drugs are victims of society. They're stealing to feed that habit. Some have turned to prostitution to feed that habit. So I need to put those individuals in diversionary programs, but not diversionary programs saying, here's probation, go figure it out, and hopefully you don't die. Diversionary programs where we are monitoring them, making sure they're successful. Are they gonna have missteps? Absolutely. But we don't give up on them. You know why? Because those people addicted to drugs that you're afraid of are someone's child, it's someone's daughter, it's someone's son. So we put them in those programs, not to incarcerate them, because that's not the answer, is giving them the help they need and following through with that. But then by the same token, we have to prosecute those people selling drugs. We have to prosecute those people who have the guns. And that is twofold. Save the people.
Here's my question. If you were there then, because you were bilingual, we know that the majority of people in the community are Latino. So if you would do that now, why didn't you do that then? Because this resident says, and many residents say, none of this stuff worked even when you were there 20 some years ago.
Okay, and this is what you're saying, and I hope you and your listeners will do this. Make me the district attorney. I was the line DA. I was an employee of Mr. Rendell, Governor Rendell. I was an employee of Ron Castillo. I was an employee. I did not set policy. We're talking about the district attorney. So I want to be district attorney to bring in that change. You understand? I was a line DA doing a case-by-case basis, trying to salvage people if I could, but I did not set policy. I was not the district attorney. That's
All right, you ran out of time, Mr. Vega. Go ahead, Solomon, for Krasner.
Right. Same question to you, Mr. Krasner. The conditions in Kensington surrounding the opioid crisis have gained a lot of attention in recent years, but as Kensington resident Bill McKinney wrote recently for WHYY, the inability to address violence, addiction, and homelessness are symptoms of a longer disease. This disease includes repeating similar failed structural responses for the past 20 years. Now, you've supported harm reduction strategies, and according to residents, that hasn't worked. And so what would you do differently now, given that Kensington is in a shambles? What would you do differently in your next term?
Thank you for that question. You know, we have to be honest about this. Kensington area has been heroin central for almost 60 years. I met a doctor who was organizing heroin addicts 60 years ago and then became the doctor at Rikers who spoke to me about this. There is a history there that is awful, and there is nothing about the hang 'em high approach of the last 35 years when Mr. Vega was in the DA's office doing nothing to change it. There's nothing about that has resulted in less drugs on the street. We have more drugs than ever. They are cheaper than ever. We have more people dying of overdoses than ever. And we have more guns than ever in Kensington, and they are cheaper than ever. So that strategy has not worked. What we need to do is we need to go towards a public health approach to deal with addiction. And we also need, in terms of enforcement, to work with the feds for what really will make a difference, but to work on long-term wiretap-based serious investigations. I am not at liberty to talk about everything that is going on, but I can tell you that the traditional response, the law enforcement response in Kensington has been grab and go. Grab that 16-year-old who's selling a couple bags of drugs, lock him up and give him a ton of time is not how you get at the people running the organization, as we did with the bust of Kip and Cambridge that effectively shut down that area, a multi-generational drug dealing area that had been controlled by the same people for a couple of decades. You have to go.
Yeah, I have to go back and ask you if that is if this different strategy is a strategy that should be used. Why haven't you done that while you've been in office? We have very specifically pursued a higher level of involvement with wiretaps. We've spoken to the police commissioner about it. We have talked to some of her top people, including Deputy Commissioner Nash. They are interested, and I am not at liberty to tell you some of the things going on, but Kip and Cambria was a bust on our watch, and it was a big one. And I think it exemplifies trying to actually deal with people who are professional drug dealers at the enforcement end, but also the reality is we need to have a public health approach to addiction. This country consumes 75% of the world's supply of opioid pills because our federal government made that happen. And as long as we have that going on, we will be where we are now, which is 3 to 4 deaths a day.
All right, Mr. Krasner, you ran out of time. Next set of questions, I'm going to go to Mr. Vega, since you just talked to Mr. Krasner. Mr. Vega, the Black community, especially in Philadelphia, suffers from over-incarceration, as we all know, especially for those low-level crimes. So Mr. Krasner had listened and he followed through by deprioritizing low-level crimes, especially those crimes of poverty. You've mentioned that you would reprioritize the prosecution of shoplifting for under $500. Many consider that a crime of poverty, especially we're in the middle of a pandemic. People in Philadelphia are experiencing food insecurity at alarming rates. Which crimes would you specifically reprioritize in your efforts to be tougher on crime?
Well, a lot of these crimes you say are crimes of poverty. I call them crimes of addiction. People are shoplifting is not because they're making a business out of it or they're stealing bread. They're stealing other items to feel an addiction, just like prostitution. A lot of these ladies who, as he calls sex workers and decided not to arrest them, are selling their bodies to feed an addiction, to give money to a pimp, to give money to a drug dealer. So what I'm saying is this, and also as my mother being a grocery store owner, think of this, if there's no accountability, everything my mother sold, she had to purchase. And if they steal it, that business is going to close and going to leave. And that public service she was performing of providing services for people in the community who don't have a car to drive 20 blocks to the ShopRite, that old lady who doesn't have a car. So I would reprioritize in terms of this. address the issue why they're shoplifting, because of drugs, why they are becoming a prostitute, because they have seeing addiction, and put them in those diversionary programs. I don't believe in incarcerating them. I believe in putting them in programs to address that addiction, to get them clean and sober, make them.
But you have actual data that shows a direct correlation that the people who engage in those crimes of addiction, as you say, are actually addicted to illegal substances or addicted to drugs.
Well, absolutely.
Like, for the most part, that's the majority of people who are engaging in those types of crimes.
Absolutely. Let's use the Dawn program. Those women who are prostitutes on the street, who are having sex for $5. Do you think they're doing that because they're sex workers, or they're victims of an addiction, of abuse? They're being robbed, raped, and abused. In that Dawn program, which they no longer have access to it, because if they're not being put into the system, they can't get that, address that issue that they need to address that addiction and get clean and sober. So what I'm saying is this: I'm not saying to incarcerate them. When they complete those programs, I would seal their record. I'm not putting them in jail. The people who need to go to jail are violent felons who are killing our youth, who are killing our children.
Mr. Krasner, a question for you. So, kind of expounding on this conversation a bit more about, like, deprioritizing, reprioritizing crimes that are attached to poverty. There's massive poverty in Philadelphia. Your approach to criminal justice has been described as rather holistic and unconventional for a prosecutor. You put quite a bit of emphasis on restorative justice, or the restorative approach, and your office engages in quite a bit of workforce development and safety networks. So that's the type of work that critics might say takes your energy away from prosecuting, from helping fight crime. How do you respond to that?
There's no higher obligation for a prosecutor than to avoid the next victimization. Every family that loses a loved one is not saying, oh, I'm whole now that you gave somebody a death sentence. I'm whole now that you gave somebody a life sentence. They want their loved one back. They want the death prevented. And the way that we prevent the next victimization sometimes is going to be a long sentence of incarceration where a defendant is truly dangerous. And sometimes, far more than in the past, it is going to be rehabilitation in different forms, holding people accountable while also putting them in a position so they won't have a reason to go back and commit further crimes. That's the heart of what we're getting at. Our main goal is to avoid the next victimization. It is to keep the bullet in the gun and have the gun go away. It is to have the 16-year-old who feels hopeless and who feels desperate feel differently, feel like they have a future, feel like they will live and they will survive. This is a strategy that is not something we came up with. This is kind of how families deal with their own kids. This is how they bring them along and get them to a better place. This is how big cities have driven down gun violence in places like Los Angeles and also in places like Chicago. And so, the notion that the most incarcerated country in the world that claims to be the land of freedom should get away from prevention and should just settle in where it's been for the 35 years that my opponent was a loyal soldier to Lynn Abraham and that type of ideology. The notion that we should go back to that just makes no sense. We see all kinds of success stories in the United States and in other places that have to do with prevention, just like we've seen success stories with medicine that have to do with prevention. That's what we want. We don't want the harm in the first place. The notion that everything gets resolved in a courtroom is simply false. And anybody who has been victimized would know that.
Joann, you get the next set of questions. And also, we're live here on WURD 96.1 FM, 900 AM, WURDradio.com, WURD TV, WURD app. You can also watch this debate, as I noticed many of you are doing, at facebook.com/4word, also youtube.com/onword if you'd like to watch the debate, in addition to listening to it on radio 96.1 FM, 900 AM. I'm Charles Ellison, joined by my colleagues, Solomon Jones and also Joann Bell, both of WURD. You are listening to, if you're just now tuning in, you are listening to an exclusive debate here on WURD between the candidates, the Democratic Party candidates for Philadelphia District Attorney, Incumbent Larry Krasner, and also challenger, former Assistant District Attorney Carlos Vega. Joann, you get the next round.
I want to circle back to an earlier question with respect to arresting people of low level in petty crimes and sex workers. And I'm going to address the first part of this question to Mr. Vega. Could you consider that there may be other reasons why women, sex workers, would be on the street other than addiction? And does poverty play any role in that?
Well, when you talk about sex workers, okay, I call them victims or slaves. No woman grows up to say, I want to be a prostitute, or I have sex with several individuals a day. These women are groomed by pimps. They're made addicted to drugs so they can control them. Now, there is a level of what you would say sex workers that we don't know about who have chosen to do that. I'm talking about those people, and I'm a father of a girl, that if she were addicted to drugs and turned to that life to feed that addiction, I would want intervention. I could love her to death, but I could not put her in that program. I would want the government to step in and help me to her fight that addiction, get clean and sober, and become the little girl and the young woman that I know she is and could be. So when you talk about these people doing voluntarily, we are victims of society. Lack of opportunity, absolutely. And the streets swallow people up. I saw that growing up with my friends. I was lucky because my mother worked very hard to put me in a Catholic school that I was safe and was able to learn. But my friends went to public school, and one good friend of mine was stabbed in the 6th grade. So yes, there is lack of opportunity. There's systemic racism. There's injustice in the world. And what I'm saying is this: I'm not putting these people in prison. I want to address their addictions by putting them in pre-arrest programs and address those addictions. Are there people who steal because they want to? Absolutely. But if you go to the Rite Aid or the CVS, a person walking with an IKEA bag and puts all that shampoo in the bag and walks out because there's no consequence, that person is selling it on the street. Why? Not to pay their rent, but to make money to buy drugs. So I have to help those people. They need that help. And also we need DAs that are more sensitive to that, DAs of color, and they have to be trained. And I'll use the example of the training that they've received.
Do you believe that all of these crimes are committed only because of addiction and not because of poverty?
Well, some crimes are committed due to poverty.
What weight would you give to that?
What weight is this?
What weight would you give poverty over the addiction?
Okay, what you're having a conversation with me is this. I am the district attorney. My job is to keep you safe. You want to go home without have somebody waiting there to kill you. You want me there to make sure a child is not sexually abused, okay? So when you're talking about poverty, yes, life is unfair. I grew up in poverty. I was poor. I was hungry. And I chose another route, which was to work hard. Even as an adult, I worked 2 jobs to feed a family, to educate a family. There are choices people make. Absolutely. Life is unfair and there is poverty. But when I look at Kensington, there are people trying to raise families there. There are businesses trying to thrive there, and they're being overrun with.
All right, you ran out of time, Mr. Vega. Go ahead, Joann. Question for Mr. Krasner.
Mr. Krasner, same question. And when I get a chance, I would like to at another round, circle back, because the question is poverty a choice? Do we choose to be impoverished? Or is it a set of circumstances brought on by a whole set of factors that have to do with discrimination, has to do with being held down over 400 years? Please tell me if you think poverty is a choice.
No, I do not think poverty is a choice. I think that this is a pretty clear illustration of the difference between my opponent and me. I think when you have deliberately held down a people, you have deliberately disinvested in communities, you have denied them access to banking, access to capital, denied them the accumulation of family wealth, you've discriminated against them in obtaining employment, discriminated against them in keeping employment. I think it has terrible consequences. When you have a society where the rich people actually got richer during this pandemic, we have more billionaires than when we started, but people making less than 40 grand get slammed, you are saying something. I know that Mr. Vega loves to keep calling me a rich white elitist. Well, let us be clear here. I have been very fortunate in my life, but when I grew up, I did not go to private schools. I was born in St. Louis. I went to an inner city school in St. Louis called Pershing Elementary School. I was there until I was about 8 or 9, and then I spent the rest of my education in the Philadelphia area in public schools. I graduated public high school. My father, who was a veteran, spent decades in a wheelchair. He had no hips. He received Social Security benefits. I ate on food stamps. He came from an immigrant family. I'm the first lawyer in that family. And my opponent knows that. He knows everything I just told you. He's heard it multiple times, but he will not stop saying whatever he wants to say to try to deceive you to win an election.
Okay, Mr. Krasner, thank you. And let's go to Solomon Jones. We ran out of time, and so Solomon Jones, you get the next round of questions.
So one of the most persistent patterns that we see nationally in case after case is DAs using a secret grand jury process to determine whether charges are going to be filed in police shooting. Given that DAs work so closely with police to secure convictions, this process has been widely and rightly, I think, criticized for the inherent conflict of interest it creates. Should grand juries be used to determine whether charges are filed in police abuse cases, or should police face the same kind of public process that other citizens do? Mr. Vega, I'll start with you. Mr. Vega.
Remove him from mute, by the way. There we go. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Vega.
Thanks, Mr. Vega.
In terms of the grand jury process, it's used, and it may be used with police because some people will be afraid to testify and the police will find out what's going on. Let's use the example of a police officer who is stepping forward and exposing some police corruption. That person needs to be safe and be secure in that there will be no ramifications or their safety. But in terms of what we're talking about now is the violence that's happening in the city. There's a grand jury process that is used when it's supposed to be used, but we have to bring this back to what's occurring in the DA's office, what's occurring in the city, what's occurring in the number of violence. People are dying at record numbers. You know, it's not a question whether you grow up poor. Being poor is not a choice.
That's not what I asked you, though. No offense, but I mean, I'm talking about a secret grand jury process that allows DAs to tell the grand jury whatever they want so that they can get the outcome that they want, which often lets police off for the abuses that they commit in our community. Should that be used or not?
Okay, well, Mr. Krasner, Larry is using that process. Larry has used it multiple times against police officers. And what has happened after that process? It comes in open court, 51 arrests, no felony convictions. Not a single police officer has gone to jail. So that's what I'm talking about. So the grand jury process, you're saying it's in secret? Yes, Larry has used it multiple times.
Have you been a part of using that grand jury process too?
I've never used the grand jury process other than investigating a drug organization.
So you have used the grand jury process, but not with police?
Not with the police.
You've never used it with police?
No, I have never.
With police, that's my question.
No.
It should not. So if you were a DA, you would not use a secret grand jury process in police abuse cases?
In police abuse cases, there are times it may be needed. Let's say it's a white supremacist group and they're going to kill the individual, but sometimes you don't. What I'm saying in the grand jury process that I've used is when I was investigating the death of a child that they gave drugs to, and another case where a defendant, a murderer, had pretended he had a mental illness, yet had done certain things to make sure he had gotten over and not been charged. And that was for the safety because that drug gang actually killed 12 people in furtherance of.
All right, Mr. Vega, you ran out of time. Go ahead, Sam, you had a question for Mr. Krasner, right?
Yeah, Mr. Krasner, same question. Grand jury processes with police officers, should that be used? And if you're using it, you know, what are you going to do differently in your next term? Because that's been used to allow police officers to get off.
Thank you for the question. you know, a lot of it has to do with the character of the chief prosecutor. If you have a chief prosecutor looking to get out of indicting police because he finds that politically convenient, let's just say he's the FOP endorsed candidate. Let's just say the FOP put a lot of money into his coffer and that's who he serves. Well, that can be dangerous, but because the fact is that in a grand jury, if a prosecutor really wants to let a police officer out of it, they can, but so can judges. I can tell you that about 20 years ago, there was an effort in a prior administration to charge a police officer with homicide. And because they did not go through a grand jury, judges threw that case out twice before it ever got to trial. That was a failure in not going to a grand jury. I have gone to a grand jury in the indictment of Officer Rook for an on-duty murder. I've gone to a grand jury in the indictment of Officer Pownell for an on-duty murder. And both of those cases are past any preliminary phase and they are going to trial. So it's not that grand juries should never be used. It's that we need to make sure that we have prosecutors who are committed to holding police accountable. Never mind Mr. Vega's usual deceptive bunch of statistics. As usual, he's giving you some pile of nonsense. He's not telling you what's actually going on. He tells you none of them were in jail. Untrue. He tells you there's no convictions. Untrue. But this is what you're going to get from him all day long. This is his typical layering of one lie after another after another. As some people have come to refer to it, I think I referenced it, it's a lasagna of lies. That's just what he does. And what we have actually seen in Philadelphia is that the times when we have gone to the grand jury, we have gotten an outcome that will allow us to get in front of a Philadelphia jury. And the times when we have had judges make determinations, we have found that the judges in municipal court, unfortunately, on a number of occasions, are much too willing to throw cases out that they would not throw out if there was any other defendant. So I don't think one size fits all. Sometimes it is a good tool, but it depends a lot on who is your chief prosecutor.
Have police officers been convicted under your watch?
We have convicted a number of police officers. We have had police officers who have been found guilty either by plea. We've had correctional officers who were kicking the hell out of somebody in custody who have been convicted by a jury.
All right, you ran out of time, Mr. Krasner. Thanks so much, Solomon. I'm going to direct the next question to Mr. Vega. So you're suing Mr. Krasner for age discrimination related to your firing. There's also you threatening to sue him over a current dispute. You seem rather comfortable using the courts for your own personal purposes. In the light of the corruption in the department you served, how can you guarantee that you won't use the DA's office as a tool for your own personal gain or for that of your political allies, like the Fraternal Order of Police?
Well, I will tell you this in terms of the question, and I'll address this. Ask Larry, has he convicted a single police officer? No. They've pled guilty with a deal. Has a single police officer gone to jail? No. Ask him the name of a police officer who's gone to jail. In terms of my suing, I'm a person of color.
Just answer my question, Mr.
Yeah, I'm answering the question. I'm answering the question. In terms of my suing Krasner for discrimination, I know my rights. That is in the federal courts. They're going to address that issue. And
but what happens when you become DA? Yeah, I mean, people are getting concerned when you become DA. Will this suddenly become some sort of political vendetta tool?
Absolutely not. When I become DA, my mission is twofold. Bringing reform to save those people that I believe can be saved, bringing a change in the system within the police department, in the DA's office. I'll use the example of the training, and I'll come back to his chief of homicide, Anthony Voci. Here's a person making $160,000 who in a road rage incident chased a black female, abused his power, had an inspector there, the full force of the police department, arresting her, confiscating her car, and he's still there. Where is the transparency? Or in their training, he put in a person, Adam Foss, who is alleged to have raped a person, who is under investigation, who is alleged that there have been several issues of misconduct. And I asked this question, how much was he paid? And where did you get the money to pay that? How about a special advisor? And let's talk about transparency. An individual is a special advisor who is a disbarred attorney who forged the signature of a judge and is in that DA's office. And once again, that individual who killed someone while working in the DA's office. So I'm talking about consequences. Am I going to abuse my power? Absolutely not. What I'm saying is, where's the accountability in the DA's office? What is happening there? And not once, and Larry will not tell you, what happened to those individuals What consequences have they suffered when they've abused their power to hurt people?
All right, Mr. Vega, you ran out of time. I have to go on to Mr. Krasner, but thanks so much, Mr. Vega. What about bail, Mr. Krasner? You said in your election campaign back in 2017, you would eliminate cash bail when you would become DA. However, you do seek nearly $1 million bail requests for cases you determine are serious. But I'm curious, what determines serious, especially when there's this case regarding this $999,999 cash bail imposed detention of a pregnant woman that the Philadelphia Bail Fund criticized you for? And if you're letting some people not pay cash bail, critics might say you're letting criminals into the communities. How do you reconcile this?
So first, we never said we were going to end cash bail. We said we were going to push against it. Ideally, I would like to see the elimination of cash bail. That's what happened in Washington, D.C. 30 years ago. Jersey now, Kentucky, Illinois just voted on it, but it requires a law that comes from the legislature telling judges that they have no power, because it is judges who set bail, that they have no power to use money. They can either hold or they can release. That's what a no cash bail system is. Some people who are so dangerous are held in custody until trial. Doesn't matter how rich they are. You can be the richest person in the world, you're not getting out because there's no amount of bail you can pay. And then the large majority of people get out without having to pay any bail, because cash bail is a harmful system at both ends. It holds poor people in jail for non-serious offenses, which we should never allow. And at the other end,
what determines serious and non-serious? What is that?
Well, you know, we get into the details on that. Obviously, for me, seriously violent stuff is at the top of it. So when we seek $1 million bail, which we do for basically every shooting, every first-degree felony rape, gunpoint robberies, 6105, which is felon in possession of a firearm, they fall into a category we consider to be very serious. If you're talking about something like, you know, somebody's third situation for shoplifting food, I consider that to be non-serious. We've done a great job at reducing poor people in jail for non-serious stuff. But judges have made their own determinations on high bail. And when we seek high bail for shootings, we are not getting it as often as I would like. This is something that we have brought to people's attention over and over and over. It's concerning to members of city council. It's concerning to others in Philadelphia. It's my hope as we move forward, we can change that working with the judiciary. But I will tell you this, the bottom line is the complete elimination of cash bail, which I would love to see, requires a piece of legislation coming from Harrisburg. And I support that 100%. I've been very clear on that. We have kept our commitment to push against cash bail throughout the entire administration.
All right. Next round of questions goes to Joann Bell. Joann?
I want to circle back to recruitment. And this question is for DA Krasner. After dismissing a record number of assistant DAs over the course of the last 3 years, you've taken your recruitment on the road. And you have visited many historically Black colleges and universities for this recruitment. Why did you do that?
Thank you for that question. I would like to point out, though, that our number was not a record number. We actually dismissed about 31 people. Ed Rendell has stated that he dismissed 25%. Our percent was actually only 5% of the total staff and only 10% of the attorneys. It's just that we did it. It wasn't done for the usual reason, which is politics. We actually did it because we wanted to make sure that the people in the office would bring about culture change, had the ethical qualifications, the diligence, and the ability to bring it about. So what did we do? We realized that the most important thing we could possibly do, and part of this was Bob Listenby's brainchild, because Bob had run an enormous organization for Barack Obama as the head of juvenile justice for the United States. If recruitment is our top priority, then that meant we had to do a lot more than the last administration did. We went to all 6 historically Black colleges and university law schools that remain in the United States. Prior administration had only gone to 1. We went to all of the top 20 law schools rated by U.S. News and recruited there, many of which had incredibly talented people, but also a very diverse student body. And then we went to the Philadelphia schools, 30 law schools. I went myself to every one of these law schools, and I often went with a first assistant. We interviewed people and we hired them. And we came home with mission-driven, hardworking people with their moral compasses intact that were incredibly diverse. It is a far more talented office than it was, frankly, when it was a Homer office that was only interested in people from Philadelphia, and when it was the office where Mr. Vega was content to be with low levels of diversity. That's what we did. You know, we truly believe in that mission. We think the achievements have been remarkable. We're very proud of it. And we are not done. There is more to be done, but that will mean we have to stay in office. There have to be more hiring cycles. We're not going to hire people because of their last name or who they're connected to, or they're John McNesby's nephew. We're going to hire them because they are talented.
Okay, let's go to Solomon Jones.
Yeah, I have
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Joann.
This is for Mr. Vega.
Mr. Vega, sorry about that. Go ahead.
The same question. And would you hire from historically Black colleges? Because I heard you on a previous debate that you thought that the DA was hiring inexperienced DAs.
Well, in terms of when you're hiring from the law school, you are an inexperienced DA. You're straight out of law school. When you're out of law school, you're not really a lawyer. You have to learn. And what I would do in recruiting DAs of color from law school is this. I have to commit to them that they're going to be paid appropriately. As we see, only 12 DAs make over $80,000 out of 114. You have to pay them. Not everyone has a commitment to work 2 jobs to support a family. I need to pay them appropriately. People of color need to be competitive with their white counterparts who usually, and the bottom line is they come from an affluent background where their families are probably paying their student loans. So with that said, I bring it back to the big issues that we're having, that we're talking about the FOP. Well, let's talk about the progress we've made. Let's talk about the police commissioner. We have Sylvester Johnson. We have Charles Ramsey. We have Richard Ross. We have Danielle Outlaw. Yet, Larry is talking about Trump, who's not the president. He's talking about Rizzo, who's been dead, what, 40 years? Well, in my journey in running for the DA's office, what I'm talking to, boots in the ground, mothers of color in the supermarket, what is their primary concern? I'm afraid for the safety of my children. I am afraid for my safety. I was at Zoom with elderly people saying, after dark, do not go to a gas station to put gas in your car. You're going to be carjacked. So the issue we're having, and Governor Rendell even said it, the primary objective or job of the DA is number 1, keeping us safe. And the people, and it's the reality, the most victims of crime are people of color. And they're telling me, I want to be safe. Too many people are dying. And then bring in reform in the court system, in the police department, and especially in the DA's office, that DAs who are doing things that are illegal, wrong, abusing their power are held accountable. And Larry Krasner has not done that. He just is not. He's not transparent. He keeps saying, I can't discuss this because we're working on something. No. Tell us what you're doing. My office is going to be transparent, and people of color are going to be able to go.
All right, Mr. Vega, you ran out of time. I'm sorry, go ahead, Solomon. Get the next round.
All right. So I'll start with Mr. Krasner then. We've seen some persistent racial patterns that have existed for years in Philadelphia's criminal justice system, especially when it comes to gun violence. For example, the Inquirer found that since 2015, almost 2,700 young Black men were wounded in shootings, but the suspected shooters were convicted in only 6% of their cases. White men of the same age were 3 times as likely to see their shooters convicted. Is there racism when it comes to the investigation of homicides in Philadelphia?
The short answer is yes. I think there's no question that there's racism when it comes to the investigation and prosecution of homicides. It's something we're trying to improve. But look at Tony Wright. Here we have a guy who does not rape and kill a woman, and nevertheless, a confession is coerced from him by means of brutality and other means. He is convicted in front of a jury, even though he's completely innocent, and he spends 25 years in jail fighting for them to do DNA taken from the body of the victim. Eventually, DNA improves to a certain point. Mr. Vega's office, the one where he was for 35 years, fights because they don't want the DNA taken. The DNA is finally taken, and it establishes conclusively that Mr. Wright has been telling the truth all along, that he had nothing to do with this, and even more startling, it tells us who did the crime. A man named Ronnie Bird, who lived 1 mile away from the victim. A man we can identify because his DNA got into a database for another crime that he committed when police coerced a confession from an innocent man and let a guilty man go. That is racism. And I can tell you conclusively, having been involved with now 20 exonerations, in every single situation but one, they were Black or brown, and in almost every single situation, they were brown. My opponent has a lot to answer for in terms of racist prosecution, because he has to answer for the fact that he knew about that DNA result. He knew the name of the actual perpetrator when he and a fellow prosecutor in the DA's office took poor Mr. Wright back to trial a second time, even though he got a new trial based upon what the DNA said. He made Mr. Wright sit in jail an additional couple of years so that he could do a trial that a jury threw out in less than an hour. And so all of us as taxpayers could pay $10 million. That is unconscionable. It is unconscionable to treat Mr. Wright like he was just a file or just a piece of paper. He was and is a human being. And it is utterly unacceptable to turn anybody, and in this case, it was a black man, into someone you use for political purposes.
Mr. Vega, same question. So when you look at the 2,700 young black men who were wounded in shootings since 2015, only 6% of their suspected shooters were convicted. White men of the same age were 3 times as likely to see their shooters convicted. Is there racism when it comes to the investigation and prosecution, quite frankly, of homicides in Philadelphia?
I'm sure there's bias within the investigation, but also there's a level of incompetence in the DA's office. When I've prosecuted individuals, whether they're white or black, I've been successful. But I want to bring it back to Anthony Wright, and he keeps talking as a talking point. That was not originally my case. There was substantial evidence that was to be presented before the jury, and the jury spoke. Well, it speaks volumes. The Innocence Project had the case for years, never brought a disciplinary action against me. And out of 450 murders, never once, even with the case that I did against Mr. Krasner, that he said he fired me for, no disciplinary action was brought against me. I'm going to bring and ask Larry this question. Mark Whitaker, a young man in Anthony Wright's case, that he made the decision, that he professed his innocence. He got a new trial, and Larry decided, let's prosecute him. He was acquitted, he was exonerated, and he's suing the city for millions, suing Larry Krasner. Or Hassan Bennett, another man who is professing his innocence, and Mr. Krasner has decided to go forward. He's made the decision. Not my bosses in the past, but Mr. Krasner's doing it. So let's talk about what Mr. Krasner is not talking about. Milan Lonkar, the young man walking his dog, that as a consequence of his incompetence was killed. Or Trayvon Register, the little 6-year-old boy I was talking about, that was beaten to death. Or how about Samar Jones, 7-year-old boy playing on his porch that was killed due to the incompetence and not caring of Larry.
Why are the killers of white men convicted consistently, since going back to when you were there, and the killers of black men are not? That was my question.
All I can say is when in every case, and the great majority of the cases, was a black man or a black woman that was killed. I have prosecuted those cases and prosecuted it successfully. Okay, so I can speak for myself of my competence and picking a proper jury. In terms of other individuals, be that DA is incompetent or picks the wrong jury, that is on them. I was properly trained. I was not allowed in the homicide unit till after 5 years of training and having done over 50 jury trials. And I was allowed in that unit. And even then, I was groomed to do more complicated cases, and it took several years. So that's.
All right, Mr. Vega, you ran out of time. And that will do it. That wraps this exclusive Philadelphia District Attorney's race Democratic primary debate. We've had both candidates for the Democratic primary in the upcoming DA race. You just heard former Assistant District Attorney Carlos Vega. For more information on him, go to vega4da.com. More information on him. Thank you, Mr. Vega. Really appreciate it. And a hand of thanks to your team as well for setting this up. You've also been hearing from the incumbent current district attorney, Larry Krasner. For more information on him, on his campaign, go to krasner4da.com. I've been co-moderating with my colleagues here at WURD, Solomon Jones. I'll ask the last round of questions, host of Wake Up With WURD, and also Joann Bell, who is host of the Black Women's Leadership Council segment on The Source here on WURD. I'm Charles Ellison. I'm typically the host, executive producer of Reality Check, Your Daily Dose of Public Affairs, every day, well, every Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. And so you can also catch all of us at On WURD. You can also catch this debate. Go to youtube.com/onword. You'll be able to find it there, and also facebook.com/4word if you'd like to get a recap. So listen, thank you everyone out there for viewing us and for listening in. I know a lot of people were listening in, a lot of people were viewing it. I want to thank the candidates and their teams once again. Thanks for making time, making yourselves available for this. It was a very important debate, very lively debate. Very much appreciate the exchange. And everyone in Philadelphia and beyond, I want you to stay smart, stay sharp, but more importantly, please, everyone, stay safe out there, be well, and we'll be talking to you again. I believe we go into The Source next here on WURD.